Okay, the first thing is we want to make sure that we put our page down. So I'm going to overlap. Well, let's go ahead and draw out some edge lines so that we can have that on there neatly. So I put the page down with some tape in the corners, and I'm just going to maybe eat into the page 1/8 of an inch. This is, of course, the sketchbook paper. All the way around. Okay, once I got that there, I'm going to go ahead and just tape all the way around the edges. And this is going to keep your page from buckling. One of the problems with working with wet media is that the page can buckle. And that can be really frustrating, to have the page buckle. Okay. All right, once we got that, make sure that you have some water. You can see here I have a cup of water, big cup full of water. I also have a small container here. I'm just going to put a little bit of water in, not much, just a little. I'm going to set this container off to the side. So this container is just for cleaning your pens out and or your brushes. Okay, this container is going to be what we put some drops of ink in to get our very dilute ink. And then eventually we may use it also for full strength ink. Haven't decided yet. All right, so let's talk about the nibs. There's a variety of different pens. This, you can see, has a square nib on it. And I believe that this is a number 3. All right. This one, as you can see, has a very pointy, needle-like nib. Now, one of the things you'll notice is if I press on that, you can see air. That's a slit that's down the middle of this. You'll notice there's a little opening right there. Corresponds with the split, right? That's capillary action pulls the ink in there. So that's like a little ink well. And this one, the square tip, you'll notice that on the back side, if we spread it, like the other nib, it's got a slit in it. So it's very similar in its construction and its use, capillary action. Now, this other type is a round type nib. So you can see the difference between the square, the round, and the point. Obviously, this round is going to have a much broader mark, softer. The square is going to be more blunt, though we can turn it on its side and get a thinner versus a thicker mark. And this is going to be a very thin mark. Okay. Now, the other thing that you'll notice that's different about this round nib is that it's got like a two-stage overlap. So instead of being split down the middle, it has this overlap that creates the capillary action. Okay, so this particular one is a B3. I think that's what we may use for our thicker lines. For sketching, we want to use something a little bit thinner. Now, the way that you put in the nib is the nib will be like this. Here's the B1, much smaller, round. That might be a good one to start with. So you see the nib has this kind of curved shank, and you'll see that the holder has these rings, and that nib fits into the outer ring in this case, and then we just want to push it all the way down in there, and it's held pretty firmly in place. Okay. Now, make sure that another part of your setup is that you have some paper. And I like to take a nice thick paper towel and fold it into sections and just have that on my workstation. And obviously you need some ink. Now, I have some Chinese ink here. Okay, it's the same as the India ink. You want to shake it. And for my initial drawing, I want to take this water and create some very transparent dilute ink. So I'm just going to put a drop or two in there. Now, you could stir it with your finger or a fork or your nib. I've got a brush here, so I'm going to go ahead and stir it up. And I'm going to just test it. You can see very little ink. Goes a long way. I actually might test this on a piece of paper instead. So that's a fairly light tone. Now you notice that when I first put it down, it looks a little darker, but that's because it's very, there's a lot of water. So if I just use a dry brush to pull up that water, that's the true tone of the ink that we're seeing here. Now we could also use, I'm going to use the 3, the thicker one, just so that we can see the mark better. So I'm going to put this back in to the holder, okay? And when you put the pen in the ink, I kind of flex it. So I'm kind of pushing down against the bottom and letting the ink pull up into the pen nib. Now, you'll notice that, well, when I first dip it, I want to kind of let it, kind of drain or tap it like this because I don't want it to splatter. So when you're drawing, as long as you're holding your pen like this and not like this, that ink is going to run out. And you can see that's a pretty good dilution of the transparency of the ink. Now, if we just compare some of the mark differences, again, you kind of press it against the bottom, which helps to kind of flex that nib so that the ink can go up into the nib itself. And again, as you're drawing, you're kind of pressing. See how much thinner that is, and how as I rotate, it becomes thicker versus thinner. It doesn't hold as much ink as the rounded nib. And then we have our really pointy nib. And again, just kind of flex it. And we can experiment with it. Very precise, but again, you can see that it doesn't hold ink for very long. Not nearly as long as a rounded nib, but that can be an advantage in creating line variation. Okay, so that's enough about the materials. The next part of the video will just be about the drawing. Okay, so I've got my fine nib, and I'm using the dilute ink to gesture in the primary and secondary contours of my fox skull. It's very thin as far as the width of the mark, and again, it's not very dark, so I'm keeping it so that it's very malleable as an image. I'm going to be able to move and change and refine as I get into the tertiary details, and the proportions, if they're bothering me, can easily be modified or adapted. I do a little bit of hatching, might as well establish the light and shadow where it is. But really, this is just a mapping procedure. Mostly line, lots of loose open lines, but a little bit of hatching. And put some ink in the container. Doesn't have to be a lot. I'm going to use my square. And basically, I'm just kind of flexing the tip by dipping it into that ink. Okay. Make sure you don't have a lot of excess. And then, as I'm working, I'm pressing. But you got to go back again and again. And the more I press, the more ink comes out. The less I press, the less ink comes out. Okay. With the round nib, I'm going to be able to go for a lot longer. So again, press. That'll start drawing the ink up. You can touch it on to get the excess off. You can see that it just goes on and on and on and on. We don't run out of ink. can use the side or press down on the tip. And you can get smaller lines that way by using it on the side, or broader lines by pressing down on the tip. And we're still going. Okay. So that's a brief overview of the tools.